Welcome. I'm Gina Sapiro. I'm the Dean of the College and Graduate School of Arts and Sciences here at Boston University. And I'm really delighted to welcome you all for the kickoff event for Alumni Weekend and to this particular program, which is one for which many of us hold a great deal of affection and look forward to every year now, which is the Howard Zinn Memorial Lecture Series lecture. Tonight's program is part of the larger Alumni Weekend, and we hope that all of those present can attend some of these other events that demonstrate the amazing range of activities and talents and so forth at Boston University today and also among our alumni. The Howard Zinn Memorial Lecture Series at Boston University is made possible by a generous gift of Alex McDonald and Maureen Strafford. Alex is a member of the College of Arts and Sciences class of 1972, and Maureen is a member of the BU Medical School class of 1976. So if I'm not too blinded by the light, there they are. Thank you very much, Maureen and Alex, for your generosity. As I think probably everybody here well knows, Howard Zinn was an author, a history professor, and a political activist whose writings changed the lives of Boston University students and readers and activists around the world. Howard taught in the College of Arts and Sciences Political Science Department for 24 years from 1964 to 1988. He was a hero, is a hero of the political left, a consistent and cogent critic of American policies, both domestic and international. He's best known for his 1980 book, A People's History of the United States, which countered the premise that history must be written by and for society's winners. We are very proud to honor his legacy here tonight. Our speaker tonight, Bob Herbert, joined the New York Times as an op-ed columnist in June 1993, writing about politics, urban affairs, and social trends in a twice-weekly column until 2011, and I'm sure a lot of us spent a lot of good time reading those columns. From January 1991 to May 1993, Mr. Herbert was a national correspondent for NBC and reported regularly on the Today Show and NBC Nightly News. Previously, he worked at the Daily News, beginning in 1976. Born in Brooklyn, Mr. Herbert earned a Bachelor of Science degree in journalism from the State University of New York, Empire State College. He has taught journalism at Brooklyn College and the Columbia University School of Journalism. He has won numerous awards, including the American Society of Newspaper Editors Award for Distinguished Newspaper Writing, and the David Nahan Prize from the Shorenstein Center at Harvard University for excellence in political reporting, and the Ridenour Courage Prize for the, quote, fearless articulation of unpopular truths. Mr. Herbert is the author of Promises Betrayed, Waking Up from the American Dream, and is currently at work on a new book, Wounded Colossus, and I believe that is the theme of tonight's lecture. So please join me in welcoming Bob Herbert.
Thank you. When the introduction gets pretty long, it means you're getting older and older. And if you don't believe me, I have to put my cheaters on, so there's the proof. It's such a great honor to be asked to deliver this lecture. So my deepest thanks to Alex McDonald and Maureen Strafford, Dean Sapiro, and the Zinn Lecture Advisory Committee, and also to Lauren Hall, who took care of so many details and made sure I had all the help that I needed. So thank you very much, all of you, for that, and thank you, everyone, for coming. Some of you, I think, had to deal with that Boston traffic outside, which is a little rough this evening. The title of this talk is, in fact, Wounded Colossus, the title of my book, but what, I was asked if I had a title for this lecture, and being as prepared as I usually am, I said, no, I hadn't really given it any thought. I said, but you could call it Wounded Colossus, because that's the title of the book that I'm working on. But then as I was working my way through this, I came to think that a good title for it might be The Next Step. And I think that you'll see why as I begin to go through this. Howard Zinn was and is a hero of mine, and that he wasn't better known and more celebrated in this society tells us a lot about the great failures of this society. I had the enormous pleasure and privilege of meeting Howard back in December 2009, and we had lunch, and as I wrote in the New York Times, I'd seldom had more fun talking about so many things that were so decidedly unpleasant. Howard had the gift of being able to talk to you about war and about inequality and about oppression without bringing you down. He did the opposite. He lifted you and made you feel that there was no reason in the world to tolerate abuse and injustice, that there was something that you could do about it, and that, in fact, you should do something about it. He had that smile and that pleasant demeanor that could be so deceptive, because he had a mind that sliced right through to the heart of the most contentious matters, exposing all those things that so many of us might prefer not to see about our country, about our fellow citizens, and very often about ourselves. Our lunch was at the Warwick Hotel in Midtown Manhattan, and we talked about the sorry state of government and politics in the U.S., the tragic futility of our escalation in Afghanistan, and the plight of working people in an economy rigged to benefit the rich and the powerful. He was already unhappy with the policies of the Obama administration on the economy and the war, but he didn't seem surprised. If there is going to be change, real change, he said, it will have to work its way from the bottom up, from the people themselves. That's how change happens. Sadly, tragically, my lunch with Howard was just a few weeks before he died. Though how we miss him now, I know you feel that way as well. Change will have to come from the people themselves, he said. And he was so right about that. We may be starting to see that change, not just with Occupy Wall Street and the protests that it has sparked in other cities and overseas, but also earlier in Wisconsin, where an unconscionable attack on the collective bargaining rights of public sector workers provoked a furious citizens' backlash. Tens of thousands turned out in Wisconsin to march in protest demonstrations, and there were court fights and a series of recall elections that resulted in 2 Republican state senators being tossed out of office. It was, in my view, a dandy fight, a heartening display of democracy in action. And it's not over. And we're seeing the people rise up in Ohio, where an even more egregious law against collective bargaining was enacted, Ohio Senate Bill 5, which makes an absolute and utter mockery of workers' rights. Bargaining on workers' health coverage is banned. Binding arbitration is banned. Incredibly, under SB 5, if an agreement is not reached between management and a union, then management, in the case of, say, negotiations with a local city council or a school board, management can just unilaterally impose its final contract offer. That's preposterous. Collective bargaining is a joke if the law allows management to impose its own terms. A Republican state senator, Bill Seitz, told the New York Times that's like going to divorce court and finding out your wife's father is the judge. When a Republican tells you that a law is unfair to working people, it is really unfair. I was in Columbus, Ohio's capital, back in June when a staggering number of signatures, 1.3 million, previously unheard of, were delivered to the State House to place a measure on the ballot to repeal that awful law. People were pumped. There was a holiday atmosphere as more than 6,000 marched through downtown Columbus in a parade that escorted the huge truck that was carrying the boxes that contained all those signatures. A vote on that important ballot measure to repeal SB 5 is coming up on Election Day, just 9 days from today. There's definitely something happening in this country. There are stirrings, maybe just the faintest beginning of a citizen's awakening. We saw it in the protests this summer against the proposed 1,700-mile pipeline that would carry crude oil extracted from the Alberta tar sands in Canada down through the heartland of the United States to the Gulf of Mexico. Thousands turned out, and more than 1,000 were arrested in the spirited and courageous demonstrations against this environmental disaster, which is just waiting to happen. Speaking about the potential impact of that pipeline project on global warming, NASA's chief climate scientist, James Hansen, had this to say: "Phasing out emissions from coal is itself an enormous challenge. If the tar sands are thrown into the mix, it's essentially game over." Bill McKibben, who organized the protest and was arrested himself outside the White House, sounded a lot like Howard Zinn as he explained why that kind of citizen action has become so essential. After the past few years, McKibben said, we're increasingly unwilling to believe that political reform can be accomplished by going through the normal channels of democracy. So something is happening. There is energy out there and dissatisfaction that, if channeled constructively, can alter the perilous course that this country has taken. Change. Sam Cooke's greatest record was a change is going to come. But make no mistake, that change, as Howard saw, will have to come from the people. Keep in mind what Bill McKibben told us: we can no longer rely on the normal democratic processes. That's sad, but it's very true. The politicians and the financial and corporate elite are never going to lead us out of the mess we're in. They're the ones who got us into it. Don't be naive. They've got the money and the power, and they are not about to give any of it up without a fight, even if their greed and recklessness are doing great harm to the country, which of course they are. If this really is an awakening, it has not come a moment too soon. The United States, a country that has always been filled with so much promise, a country in which I have been privileged to live a truly wonderful life, has lost its way. We keep fighting these seemingly endless wars that take such a devastating human toll and that cost us endless shiploads of cash, trillions of dollars, as the economist Joseph Stiglitz has documented. Afghanistan is now the longest war in our history, and no one has any idea what we're still fighting for. While we pursue this madness overseas, an army of the long-term unemployed is spread across the land here at home. The human fallout from the Great Recession and long years of misguided economic policies. The few jobs now being created too often pay a pittance, not nearly enough to pry open the doors to a middle-class standard of living. And while we continue our destructive policies overseas, these destructive overseas adventures with our Rambo-esque foreign policy, back here in the USA, what are we doing? We're demolishing school budgets, closing libraries, laying off teachers, police officers, and firefighters, and generally letting the bottom fall out of our quality of life. Welcome to America in the second decade of the 21st century. The College Board told us just last week that total student loan debt in the United States will surpass $1 trillion this year. Last year, for the first time in history, more than $100 billion in student loans were taken out by young men and women trying to establish some semblance of a foothold on an ever-receding American dream. Talk about mortgaging your future. One night, after I'd moderated a program on Afghanistan at the Kennedy Library right here in Boston, a World War II veteran, a man in his 80s, came up to me and, speaking generally about the state of affairs in the U.S., he asked plaintively, "What happened to us?" His tone and weathered face conveyed a sense of real loss. He'd known a different America, having worked as an engineer and raised a family in the Midwest in the post-war period when the United States, despite many severe problems, showed every sign that it was really getting its act together. I know something about that era, having grown up in the 50s and 60s in a suburban town in New Jersey. Jobs were plentiful. More and more young people were going to college, and their education was affordable. Americans, by the tens of millions, were moving into the economic mainstream. America was on a roll in those Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson years. Economic, social, and cultural doors were being flung open, one after another. There was a buoyancy to the American experience that was extraordinary. I'm not looking back through rose-colored glasses. I know as well as anyone that the nation was far from perfect. There was plenty of conflict, small-mindedness, and bigotry. Blacks and women had to mobilize to fend off treatment that was hideously unfair. Vietnam would prove to be an unmitigated disaster. But there was also an openness to new ideas and a willingness to extend a collective hand to those who were struggling in those days. The middle class was growing, and it was not yet a mortal sin for someone running for public office to mention the poor. In those heady, sun-washed days, described by the writer Nelson Lichtenstein as the high noon of American capitalism, everything embodied in the great promise of the United States, freedom, equality, opportunity, and widely shared prosperity, appeared to be coming to fruition. Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote of the mid-60s that steadily increasing affluence seemed an enduring and irreversible reality of American life. The Temptations of Motown, one of my favorite groups, the Temptations, who helped power the era's soundtrack, sang of momentary setbacks in love, oh yes, but they felt compelled to add the sociological aside, there's plenty of work and the bosses are paying. The Temptations. Half a century later, the plaintive question of that now elderly World War II veteran hangs in the air. What happened? How did this proud and triumphant nation, a robust, thriving country that served as the economic and cultural model for much of the world, end up in such deep trouble? How did we reach a state of affairs in which there is so much suffering in America, much of it unseen? Examples include the families crushed in the economic downturn, the thousands of men and women who have returned badly wounded from Iraq and Afghanistan, and the millions of children whose futures are being foreclosed by poverty and shrinking opportunities. It seems to me that our spirits sank along with our bank balances. For someone who grew up when I did, I couldn't help but notice that a great change has come over the very character of the country. Not only is the U.S. no longer a place of widely shared prosperity, it no longer has the same tough, can-do attitude that it once had, and the same almost limitless optimism. As I travel the country doing research for my book, I've noticed a tendency toward timidity and even resignation in the general population that surprised me. I remember the U.S. as a far more confident and boisterous place in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Kids, grown-ups, everybody had their dreams and were unabashedly flexing their muscles, ready to make them come true. The bigger the dream, the better. The U.S. was the place where even impossible dreams came true. That's how we felt when I was growing up. That bold confidence in the future now seems as old-fashioned as typewriters and telephone booths. Polls show that Americans are not even confident that their children will grow up to enjoy an improved standard of living. They're afraid that as a society, we're going backwards. The American dream, as I've said many times in speeches around the country, the American dream is on life support. So what did happen? My best answer is that we lost sight of what we were about and who we were supposed to be. Fear began to trump freedom, and after the September 11th attacks, we blindly followed leaders who led us into endless war. We've traded many of our civil liberties for a promise of security that cannot be kept, and we've sacrificed much of our moral leadership in the world. On the domestic front, selfishness and greed displaced the quintessential American values of equality and shared prosperity. This was never supposed to be a country of, by, and for the rich, and yet that's what we've allowed ourselves to become. This was never supposed to be a country in which the chief business of the two major political parties was to carry out the wishes and the schemes of the corporate and financial elite. This was never supposed to be a plutocracy, and yet that's what we've become. We're surrounded by absurdities, and I'm not just talking about the Herman Cains and the Rick Perrys of the world and the rest of that sort of slapstick GOP field. As much fun as it might be to do a riff on them, I'm not going to, because the absurdities are not limited to the Republicans. You know there is something terribly wrong when the job czar for a Democratic president is the chief executive officer of General Electric. Please. Jeff Immelt, GE's worthy successor to neutron Jack Welch, got rid of nearly 30,000 good American jobs between 2005 and 2010. What kind of a job czar is that? It's like asking Dick Cheney to lead your peace movement. Whatever you might say about GE, it does not have America's best interests at heart. Back in March, the New York Times had an article that carried the headline, "GE's Strategies Let It Avoid Taxes Altogether." The article said despite profits of $14.2 billion, profits, $5.1 billion from its operations in the United States, General Electric did not pay any U.S. taxes last year. I remember complaining when that article came out that it's a little weird that my wife Debbie and I would pay more in federal taxes than the General Electric Corporation. But I suppose that's what a plutocracy is all about. All the good stuff is up at the top. According to the Times, GE's extraordinary success at avoiding taxes was, quote, based on an aggressive strategy that mixes fierce lobbying for tax breaks and innovative accounting that enables it to concentrate its profits offshore. Innovative accounting. Innovation once meant creating new products and industries and incredible scientific and cultural advances. One of our greatest innovations was during the Depression, when we made it the norm in the United States, the first country to do so, to have our children graduate from high school. Now, instead of initiatives designed to create a better future, we develop innovative tax schemes and weird financial products that add nothing but grief to our society, and we have to hitch a ride with the Russians if we want to visit the space station. By the way, I find that hitching a ride bit to be particularly embarrassing, having lived through the exciting and inspiring period that culminated in our landing a man on the moon. Talk about losing your way. Jack Welch became one of our cultural heroes, which I always thought was bizarre. What exactly was it about Jack Welch that we admired? He was called Neutron Jack, a play on the words neutron bomb, because of his extraordinary talent for getting rid of employees while leaving the buildings that they once worked in still standing. By selling off companies and flat out firing people, Welch got rid of more than 200,000 GE employees in the early to mid-1980s. GE now has way more employees overseas than it has in the United States. And yet its CEO is President Obama's point person on job creation here in the USA. That's a good example of why we cannot rely on the normal channels of democracy. You'd have to be delusional to think that Jeffrey Immelt is going to lead us out of the unemployment wilderness. America is supposed to be a peaceful and a prosperous nation, A quick and honest look in the mirror would tell us that we're anything but. We fight these wars overseas that we can't pay for and don't know how to win. And we don't even bother counting all the people that we kill. We're intervening militarily in country after country, blowing up this target and that, including innocent men, women, and children, the so-called collateral damage, whether we've declared war or not. We had every right to go into Afghanistan, chasing after bin Laden and al-Qaeda. I absolutely supported that intervention. I supported that war. But that was more than 10 years ago. What are we fighting for now? Our leaders must never have read The Best and the Brightest or taken to heart any of the lessons from the tragedy of Vietnam. They must not have listened to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who warned in his famous speech at Riverside Church in 1967 of the terrible danger of sending American troops off to fight, in King's words, in support of governments which were singularly corrupt, inept, and without popular support. If only President Obama had taken those words to heart as he pondered whether to increase our commitment on behalf of Hamid Karzai, who remained in power in Afghanistan after an election that the whole world knew was riddled with fraud, and whose government is one of the most corrupt and inept on the planet. This is the same Hamid Karzai who said just last week that if the United States and Pakistan went to war, he'd side with Pakistan. That's our partner in the longest American war in history. In that other war, President Obama tells us we'll be out of Iraq by the end of the year. Given America's short attention span, our tendency will be to have a celebration as the final troops come home and then forget about that awful war and what it did to us and to the Iraqi people. My view is that the more said about Iraq, the better. We need to meticulously examine that catastrophe and show how much harm it really did. And we need to develop policies to avoid warfare in the future, except in the most extreme circumstances. And should those tragic circumstances arise, Americans from all walks of life should be called upon to fight. It's much too easy to go to war when you know that the war is going to be fought by other people's children, when you know that neither your family nor you will have to make any sacrifice at all. I am not a pacifist. I served in the Army way back in the 1960s. I was a sergeant in intelligence, so I'm not opposed to defending this country. But I am opposed, as Obama once said, to stupid wars. And I think that Iraq was a stupid war, and I think that we allowed Afghanistan to become something that it never was supposed to have been. There was a mention on the Morning Joe program just this week about an Army Ranger who was killed in Afghanistan on his 14th tour in the war zones. That's just wrong. We're supposed to be better than that. Here at home, we've got an economy that is squeezing the vitality out of our society. Jeff Immelt and the others at the top live in the kind of luxury that the Rockefellers could only have imagined. But most Americans are struggling, and many are going down for the economic count. Members of the Progressive Caucus in Congress put it this way: persistent mass unemployment constitutes a national emergency and a human calamity that is damaging all facets of the United States economy. Roughly 25 million Americans are in need of full-time work, including underemployed Americans and those who have simply given up looking for work. The numbers are stark for everyone, but even more so for minority communities. While unemployment stands at 9.1% nationally, it's over 11% for Hispanics and almost 17% for African Americans. More and more Americans are facing or living in poverty, desperately in need of a good job at a living wage. When I was out in Ohio, I was put in touch with a man who had lost his job as a $64,000 a year branch manager at a GE subsidiary. He was married and the father of a 4-year-old, and here's what I wrote about him. Mr. Harper remembers well the feeling of having hit bottom. He'd been unemployed for the better part of a year, and there was still no job in sight, not even part-time work. Uncertainty was giving way to a well-founded fear. Harper was in an economic sinkhole, and the nasty scent of destitution was in the air. He'd never thought of himself as poor. But now, with the family's savings gone, he and his wife and his young son seemed to fit right into that previously unimagined category. Was it really possible that they'd fallen out of the middle class? His insides churned at the thought. No, he told himself, he would not allow himself to become poor. If he just kept looking, he'd find a job. At the moment, though, he was flat broke, and he had to do something about that. With the bills stacked frighteningly high and his savings depleted, without even enough money to buy food for the next few days, he came to the grim conclusion that he had no choice but to drive into downtown Columbus and sell some of his blood. We have really lost our way. You shouldn't have to give blood to put food on the table for your family, not in the United States of America. We've all heard the jobless statistics over and over, but behind those bloodless stats, real-life American workers and their families, millions upon millions of them, are suffering. Unemployed older people, their options exhausted, are being forced into premature retirement. Men and women in their 20s and 30s, including many with college degrees, have moved back home with mom and dad, forced into retreat by an employment market that mocks the dreams of the young. The wreckage in that job market resembles the ruins of a country that has lost a war. Millions are laboring in low-quality jobs for which they are overqualified by education and experience. College graduates are working at jobs that require only a high school education, taking jobs away from people who only have a high school diploma. For those who think a college degree confers some kind of immunity in this employment disaster, you should think again. The median annual income of college graduates has declined by more than $4,000 just since the year 2000. That's an income plunge of nearly 10%. 6 million manufacturing jobs, 1/3 of the entire sector, disappeared from 2000 to 2010. Another 2 million construction jobs were destroyed when the housing market crashed and burned. It should have been obvious from Jump Street that what we're going through was not a typical cyclical downturn to be followed by a swift and robust recovery. This was a rout in a labor market that was already hurting badly when the Great Recession struck. For 30 years or more, American workers have been bludgeoned by offshoring, labor-saving technological advances, an unconscionable but brutally effective war against labor unions, and the virtual end of worker participation in the substantial benefits of their own increased productivity. It's not terrorism or some foreign foe that is the greatest threat to America as we've come to know it. It's the long, dark night of chronic unemployment. With so many people out of work, and with the housing market in shambles, and so many homes underwater, state and local governments are being starved of revenues needed to deliver essential public services. Strapped for cash, they have gotten rid of an incredible 600,000 jobs just since mid-2008. That includes hundreds of thousands of teachers and other public school personnel. Some school districts have gone to 4-day weeks to save money. The cities of Camden and Trenton in New Jersey, my home state, each laid off about 1/3 of the police force. Trenton is the state's capital. Flint, Michigan cut its police force by 1/4. These are disastrous developments, guaranteed to have a negative effect on the quality of life. We're in a world of hurt in this country, and not enough of us are paying close enough attention. You want to know what happened to us? I'll tell you what happened to us. That transformation of values that gave a place of honor to selfishness and greed inevitably resulted in us as a society turning our backs on working people, ordinary people. We lavished obscene riches on the bankers and the corporate CEOs, enough to allow them to live like sultans and potentates without paying very much attention to what was going on. We gave them virtually everything they wanted in terms of wildly beneficial tax, corporate, and finance policies, and never stopped to consider the consequences. I heard just before I came over here tonight that ExxonMobil is now enjoying record profits again, and yet they are being subsidized by American taxpayers. What kind of craziness is that? In the process of all of this, we betrayed all those ordinary working men and women who mean so much to our society. We got our perspective all fouled up. We forgot who's really important in this country, who makes up the heart and soul of the United States of America. It's not the bankers who try to bleed us of every red cent, who rip us off like loan sharks by charging outlandish interest on our credit cards while paying us next to nothing on our savings. They're not the ones who deserve our admiration or require our support. It's not the CEOs who build up their obscene bonuses by sending working people to the unemployment line. They're not the ones who really matter in this society. The people who are truly important to America are those men and women who go to work each day and raise their families and pay their bills and try to send their children to college, and who don't spend all of their time trying to figure out how to take advantage of other people. I'm talking about those men and women whose work each day builds the bridges and the highways and the schoolhouses of America, people who teach and look after our children, people who take care of the sick and the infirm and write the books we read and come running whenever there is an emergency. These are the people who really matter in America, and these are the folks we've betrayed by policies that favor only the very wealthy and by our craven political leadership that gives lip service to the middle class. They never even bother to mention the poor, but they give lip service to the middle class while always dancing to the tune of their corporate masters. We cannot let this go on. Things have to change in this society. It's no wonder such extraordinary wealth accrued to the richest 1% of the population, and especially the richest 1/10 of 1%. We forgot about everybody else and never even bothered to pay attention as the real incomes of ordinary men and women stagnated or declined over the past 30 to 40 years. That's what happens when you turn selfishness and greed into virtues. When the credit and housing bubbles burst and the whole lousy house of cards was on the verge of coming down, we bailed out the banks and the financial institutions that caused this terrible economic crisis, but we've done almost nothing for the men and women who have lost their jobs, or the families facing foreclosure, or the ones with homes that are underwater, with mortgage balances higher than their homes are worth. Class warfare? Those who object to this state of affairs are accused of fomenting class warfare and of favoring redistribution of the wealth. You have got to be kidding me. We've been engaged in a class war for the longest time. A savage war has been waged against working people in this country for decades. That's why it's been so difficult for ordinary people to get ahead. As for the redistribution of wealth, the corporate and financial elite live to redistribute the wealth, all of it, to themselves. That's their entire raison d'etre. I didn't hear any complaints about redistribution of the wealth from them when it was all being sucked to the top. This is indeed class warfare, and there are casualties galore. We're letting a whole generation of students sink beneath the weight of their college loans. And then there's the poor who live entirely outside the consciousness of the society's movers and shakers. More than 46 million Americans are poor, and 17 million are living in deep poverty. Those are folks trying to make it on incomes of less than half of the official poverty line. That would be, for example, a family of four with an annual income of $11,000 or less. Imagine that, a family of 4 with 11 grand to live on for a year. 17 million people are in that awful situation in the United States of America in 2011. We're letting black and brown people in the U.S. suffer through conditions that amount to a full-blown depression. I've visited black neighborhoods in which hardly anyone has a legitimate job. It's heartbreaking. Take a walk through sections of Dorchester, and you'll see what I mean. More than 1/3 of all black children in America are growing up in poverty. We decided that the way to get the economy moving again was not to focus on the middle class and the poor, but to make the rich even richer. We kept buying into that tired old Reagan-era mantra of trickle down. Well, those waiting for the wealth to trickle down will wait forever. Not only is trickle down morally reprehensible, it doesn't work. This is not just a crisis for the unemployed. It's a crisis for all of us. Consumer spending accounts for 70% of the output of the American economy. Deprive too many of those consumers of gainful employment, which we've done, and you'll end up with a catastrophe on your hands, which is what we've got. Workers have got to earn enough money to make the purchases that keep this consumer economy going. This was once widely understood. As FDR put it, this nation cannot endure if it is half boom and half broke. In other words, without jobs, we're dead. You cannot revive the economy without putting Americans back to work. But the politicians don't seem to get this. They're obsessed with budget deficits. They keep talking about austerity. I've got a message for all those deficit hawks out there. I don't care how many vital services you cut. You can cut Social Security, you can cut Medicare, you can cut the programs that keep our food safe and our water clean, you can cut until every last proverbial cow comes home, but you cannot bring the deficits under control if you don't put Americans back to work so that they can pay taxes. We have to put Americans back to work again. But this is a crisis for all of us for reasons that go beyond employment and the economy. It's a crisis because I don't think this is the kind of country that we want, a country in which everyone is on his or her own, a country in which we do not look out for one another and we let those who have come upon hard times just sink in their own misery. I don't think we want this to be a country that is engaged in incessant warfare, wars in which only a very tiny sliver of the population is called on to fight. We don't want this to be a country in which all the benefits accrue to the few and all the sacrifices are made by the many. My message to you tonight is that conditions in our country do not have to be this way. We have the power to change them, but that will require a very heavy lift. Excuse me. We need to commit to that lift now, because the moment to begin real change is at hand. I'm not talking about next month. I'm not talking about next week. I'm not talking about tomorrow. I'm talking about tonight. We all have to do our part. Right now is the time for us, all of us, to make our commitment to turn this country around. Let's take our cue from Occupy Wall Street and all those other protest efforts out there. We don't need Occupy Wall Street to lay out a blueprint for America's future. That's not what they're about. What we need to do is pay close attention to what the protesters are saying. Theirs is a cry of the heart, and that cry has tapped into the tremendously deep well of distress in the population at large. Occupy Wall Street is a vivid, spontaneous, dramatic expression of the pain that has gripped so many in America. As I watched the protests develop, I thought of Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, which he wrote in 1963 to a group of apparently well-meaning ministers who wondered if his protest demonstrations weren't, quote, unwise and untimely, close quote. Isn't it interesting how it's never quite the right time for the oppressed to press their grievances? Dr. King replied by patiently explaining why people protest. You may well ask, he wrote, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are quite right in calling for negotiation, he said. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks to so dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. That's what's going on in Lower Manhattan right now and in so many other parts of the country. All these issues that we all care so much about are right out there in front of the mainstream now where they cannot be ignored. But it's up to us, it's up to you and me, all of us, to build on the momentum that these brave protesters have established. It's up to us to take the next important step, to fashion a campaign so formidable and compelling that it ultimately carries the day. And how do we do this? Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson, in one of the most important books of the past several years, Winner Take All Politics, describe how conservative ideologues and the financial elite discovered decades ago how essential it was to organize themselves and pool their considerable resources to achieve their desired ends. I've always thought it was important to study the other team's game plans, and that other team in this case is organized every which way from sundown. If we really want to move to a fairer, more peaceful, more equitable, and more just America, we have to better organize ourselves and make better use of the considerable resources that we have on our side. That's how we begin to build the momentum that's been established by Occupy Wall Street and all that other ferment that's out there. We knew in 2008 that Americans wanted change, but that change hasn't happened. Why? Because change, as Howard Zinn told us, has to work its way from the bottom up, from the people themselves. I hear all the complaints about Barack Obama, and I've joined in them, initiated some of them, in fact, a fair number of them. But the failure to bring about the changes we want in our society is not Barack Obama's failure. It's ours. You don't just vote for somebody and sit back and wait for the change to happen like you're watching television. We have to make it happen. It's up to us. You don't just vote for somebody and then say, oh my goodness, my job is done. And I think the first thing that we need to do now, we're a little late coming to it, but we need to do it now. We need to identify those progressive leaders who can begin to pull together the many disparate protest efforts into a cooperative, organized movement that has not just real power, but enormous power, the power to really change this country. There are wonderful figures in the progressive firmament right now. My friend Bill Moyers, who gave this very lecture last year, is someone we need to be listening to very closely. Bill knows what this rule by and for the rich is doing to us. Plutocracy and democracy don't mix, he said. Plutocracy too long tolerated leaves democracy on the auction block, subject to the highest bidder. Bob Borisage and Roger Hickey are doing wonderful work at the Campaign for America's Future. Bob recently wrote the following: Occupy Wall Street has no policy agenda, but it has utter moral clarity. The demonstrators have built an island of democracy in the belly of Wall Street. The bankers looking down on them would be on the street had not taxpayers bailed them out. No one is confused about the message, Borisage said. Wall Street got bailed out, Main Street was abandoned. The top 1% rigs the rules and pockets the rewards, and 99% get sent the bill for the party they weren't even invited to. I've already mentioned Bill McKibben, who led the pipeline protests and has tried mightily to raise the nation's consciousness about global warming. Here's what he said as he was about to be arrested last August. "It's not the easiest thing on earth for law-abiding folk to risk arrest, but this pipeline has emerged as the single clearest test of the president's willingness to fight for the environment. So I wore my Obama 08 button," he said, "and I carry a great deal of hope in my heart that we will see that old Obama emerge. It's hot out here today, especially when you're wearing a suit and tie, but it's nowhere near as hot as it's going to get if we lose this fight." That's Bill McKibben. And we've got the wonderful Barbara Ehrenreich on our side. She reminded us recently about the relentless struggle of the poor just to survive day to day, the poor that our political leaders never want to talk about. Excuse me. Ehrenreich wrote, "Food is another expenditure that has proved vulnerable to hard times, with the rural poor increasingly turning to food auctions, which offer items that may be past their sell-by dates. And for those who like their meat fresh, there's the option of urban hunting." In Racine, Wisconsin, a 51-year-old laid-off mechanic told me he was supplementing his diet by shooting squirrels and rabbits and eating them stewed, baked, and grilled. Ehrenreich tells us in Detroit, where the wildlife population has mounted as the human population ebbs, a retired truck driver was doing a brisk business in raccoon carcasses, which he recommends marinating with vinegar and spices. These are not images from the 1930s. These are scenes from the United States of America in 2011. I want some of these brilliant, progressive individuals, and there are many others that I don't have time to mention tonight, to come together for serious meetings about how to harness the ferment that's out there now in ways that will bring about the change that this country so desperately needs. I am so serious about this. Let's use those meetings to identify the leaders who will become the public face of a progressive movement to really change America. We can't just focus on civil rights or workers' rights, as important as they are. We can't limit our effort to the environmental movement or to the women's movement or the gay rights movement or the peace movement. We need the energy and counsel, the genius of all those movements. We don't just want reform here and there, reform that can be watered down, ignored, or repealed. We want to transform America. We want to raise our levels of consciousness and our powers of empathy. We want to make this country a better place. Let's start tonight. Make our commitment tonight. Let's send the message to the American people that change, real change, is on its way. The era of the 1%ers is over. We have to let the people know that the rest of us, the 99%, despite our many differences, are all in this together. If we work hard enough to make our case in ways that are compelling and cannot be refuted, we will carry the day. In making our case, we need to pressure the mainstream media to pay more attention to the voices of progressive America and to begin covering in a real way the hardships being endured by the middle class, the working class, and the poor. These are not medieval times that we're living in. This is not supposed to be yet another era of lords and vassals, masters and serfs. Rule by the richest 1% has to cease. They can no longer be permitted to take so much of the bounty of this great nation for themselves. Am I talking about redistributing the wealth? As they used to say long ago, back in the days when you had to go to a record store to get your music, and only birds could tweet, I'll say, as they said in those days, You bet your sweet bippy I'm talking about redistributing the wealth. Read my lips, redistribute the wealth. Start with the tax code and start right now. We have to put Americans back to work. We have to rebuild our failing infrastructure. We have to revitalize the public schools. We have to make college more affordable. We have to do all these things, and we can't do it if the top 1% is permitted to hoard all of the wealth in our society. We want a society that is fair, equitable, and just, not one where the rich have it all. There is so much to do, and it is up to us to see that it gets done. Real change comes from the bottom up. Those bankers looking down with disdain from the plush heights of their Manhattan towers can no longer be permitted to pull the strings of our daily lives as if they were the puppet masters and we were the marionettes. Let's not be like General McClellan in the Civil War, who had a powerful army but was afraid to use it. Let's not be like that person in the Bonnie Raitt lyric who was afraid to throw a punch that might land. This is not a fight for the faint of heart. Let's use our resources. Let's pull together the most powerful progressive leadership this country has ever seen. Let's follow the example of Howard Zinn, who told us that people, when organized, have enormous power, more than any government. Our history runs deep, Howard said, with the stories of people who stand up, speak out, dig in, organize, connect, form networks of resistance, and alter the course of history. I am saying to you tonight, it's up to us to alter the course of American history in the 21st century, and I have no doubt that we can do that if we set our minds to it. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you. So, thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks very much. I am told that the floor is to be open to questions. Boy, let's see what you got to throw at me now. Are there microphones? How do we do this? Do I just pick somebody and the microphone will go to them? All right, this gentleman right here in the middle. Thank you so much. Yeah, if you say wonderful talk, make sure you say that into the mic. Oh.
Now, I agreed with so much of what you said, but there was one omission that I kept wanting to hear you talk about, and that had to do with the Supreme Court. And the line that kept going through my mind was, yes, corporations are people, my friend. What do we do about it?
You know, this is so hard. This is so hard. I struck that line. There is an effort now to have a constitutional amendment to overturn that terrible decision. And we actually, Bill Moyers and I actually met with the fellows who are leading that effort, and I had a reference to it in the speech, and I figured this thing is running too long and folks are going to get all weirded out if I don't cut some of this stuff, and that line got cut. That is such an important, point. We have to do something about this idea that corporations are people. Of course they're not. Someone said recently, I can't remember who it was, but they said, I'll believe corporations are people when Governor Perry straps one into, I don't know, puts one into the execution chamber or some weird thing like that. But I agree with you wholeheartedly. We have to do something about that. And that's also one of the reasons why it's so important. I have all kinds of problems with President Obama. I haven't made any secret of that. But when you look at the alternative, it's really frightening. And one of the big things that's problematic is that the Republicans have a very good chance of taking the Senate in this next election. And if they get a Republican president as well, they're going to have at least 2 more appointments to the Supreme Court. And then, to use one of the references from James Hansen, it's game over if they get 2 more appointments to the Supreme Court. So it's very important. I was very serious about the idea that we have to do our part. I don't think it's enough for us to sort of sit back and watch if we really care about what's going on in the country. We have to get involved. But your point is a good one. That Supreme Court, Citizens United, that Supreme Court decision was a hideous decision, and we have to do something about that. Yes, sir.
There's a point also that means a lot to me that I didn't hear you mention, and you've probably spoken on it many times. But as I've lived my life and talked to people, I've been struck by how many Americans think we actually live in a democracy at the federal level, and that we don't have a plutocracy. We're in a university here, and I think we all should understand that the country was formed at the federal level not to be a democracy. And we can say what we want about President Obama, but I know on the night that he was elected, my wife and I were very happy. But we looked at each other and we said, nobody is talking about the fact that the filibuster is some sort of a sacrosanct item. Think for fact that the United States Senate, you can have 18% of the people get 50% of the votes and 82% get 50%. You can call it what you want, but please stop calling it democracy. It doesn't exist. And then when you only have 41 people out of 100 that can stop everything over again, we never hear it in the media, we don't hear it in the press, the written media, we certainly don't hear it on the televised media or the radio. People just keep saying Congress, Congress, Congress. One of the root causes, it's not the only thing, is the simple fact that we have embedded in our system the mechanism that the 1% warrior can exist. We have embedded in our system a way that everything can continue to go to the wealthy. And your comments are stirring and wonderful, but unless, as part of the whole mix, as people, we understand we need a systematic change in what we have as government, then we really have a problem. I remember I was embarrassed in 2005. I'm not a world traveler, but I was sitting at a bar once in Prague, of all places, and a man was talking next to me, and he was interested that I was American. He asked me a question. He said, how, sir, can you call yourself the greatest democracy in the world, which we do every day of my life? And he said, when you come in second as president, you win. I had no answer.
Well, you good points all. On the filibuster, there was a time when you actually had to be on the Senate floor and follow through on a filibuster. I mean, now it's basically, just sort of going through the motions, and I completely agree with you that subverts the very idea of a democracy or a representative democracy, which is what we're supposed to have. If you combine that, but if you also combine the influence of money in politics and the fact that the 2 major parties are controlled by the big money interests, I have to agree with you that fundamentally we don't have a democracy. We certainly don't have a functioning democracy. But we do have the vote still in this country. And if we could get the populace to understand sort of the dire state, not just that we're in economically, but to your point, the dire state that we're in terms of the functioning of the government, then it is possible to correct that in the United States. But it is a very heavy lift. And I'm not sure how optimistic I am. Yes, ma'am. Yes. We got microphone. I think you got to wait for a microphone. I think you have to wait for a microphone. Oh, you have to go to a microphone. Here we go.
There's very little manufacturing in this country and almost no industry. Those jobs have all gone abroad. Where are these jobs going to come from that our people need?
They're not going to come. We are not going to build up anything like the robust manufacturing sector that we once had. And there were many people who have been warning about this at least since the 1980s, certainly since the 1990s, when we had all the arguments over NAFTA and that sort of thing. We are going to have to look to alternative ways. We should have as much manufacturing. We should try and put together as much manufacturing in this country as we can, but we're also going to have to look to alternative ways of powering this economy. And if it turns out that it is inevitable, which is possible, that standards of living are going to have to come down in this country, they're coming down for a lot of people right now, obviously, but if it turns out that we can't support the kind of standards of living that we had become used to, then we need to put in place mechanisms to sort of orchestrate the pain that people feel so that you can minimize sort of the lowering of those standards so that, again, there's shared sacrifice and you don't have a bunch of people whose living standards are plunging and other people whose living standards are coming down just a tad, you know. I think that we need to be, people always talk about having a national conversation about this thing or that, and we never have it. But we really need to have a national conversation about what kind of economy we're going to have going forward, how we're going to be able to provide an education, including a college education for our young people, because right now it's not affordable, and what the American standard of living is going to be over the next 2 or 3 decades or so. We're not talking about any of that stuff. We have a Looney Tunes campaign for president right now. The Republicans are beyond the pale. I mean, they look like the lineup from It's a Mad, 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 Mad World or something like that. But the Democrats aren't talking seriously either. The Democrats don't have solutions to our worst crises. So we're really in a fix. I mean, it goes back to what Howard Zinn said. It's going to have to come from the bottom up. My real fear, I really hope this doesn't come to pass, my real fear is that we get plunged into another depression, and then people are going to start going, you know, oh my God, how did this happen? Okay, now what are we going to do? So, you know, if we could fend it off before something terrible like that happens, it would be good. Yes, sir.
Mr. Herbert, my name is Jeff. I want to thank you very much. Your remarks were powerful and inspiring.
Thank you.
I want you to know that I took a step today. I've been in touch with Occupy Boston people. I'm going to meet with them next week about organizing some community dialogues amongst the Occupy people and surrounding community on a variety of topics.
I think that's fantastic, by the way. Yeah. I mean, I guess
Last year,
right, that all-important word, organize. I mean, we have to get better organized. Thank you for doing that.
You're very welcome. Last year, I had the privilege of asking Bill Moyers at this lecture a question about if the American dream, he made the case that it is a plutocracy, and I said the American dream has kind of gone down the tubes as far as what I grew up believing. And I said, I wondered if my fellow alumni and other people in the audience believed it, because we weren't doing very much about it. And he talked about how we were in denial. Basically, we were in denial. And what a difference. I heard E.J. Dionne, one of your colleagues on the radio today, saying a month or two ago it was all about deficit reduction. That captured the national media attention. Now we're talking about the rich-poor gap and having the Wall Street perpetrators being brought to justice again. So the tune has changed, and he attributed that largely to the Occupy Wall Street people bringing this to national attention.
I agree with EJ on that. You know, I spent most of my adult life in the media, 41 years on one kind of deadline or another, and you know, I made a good living, so I'm not one who's spent a lot of time running around bashing the media. But I do think that the press has done a terrible job covering the big crises facing the country in recent years. I mean, I think just a terrible job. And also, the PAC journalism, which was always a problem, now is insane. It's almost as if the press can only function on, can only focus on one story at a time. Now, what has happened is that Occupy Wall Street, especially because it's visible, it's great television, you've got video, has in fact caught the attention of media. Now, whether that can be held, and that would not be enough in and of itself, remains to be seen. But more important is whether there is something more substantive in terms of organization and strategy that can be built on top of this momentum that's being developed with Occupy Wall Street and the other protests, and if we could bring enough pressure to insist that these issues continue to be covered by the press. All of that is problematic, but all of that needs to be done. Yeah.
I'd like to actually ask a question. A couple of weeks ago, a black activist in Boston, outspoken person, Jamal Crawford is his name, he went down to Occupy Boston, and he talked at length about how, as he said, my people have been dealing with these issues for years in terms of economic discrimination and hardship due to our economic system. And he challenged people to come to the hood. 1 week ago tonight, I was not able to go, but there was a march from Dewey Square, which is where Occupy Boston is, to Dudley Square for what they called Occupy the Hood, and they also called it Blackupy Boston, too.
That's great.
And it's on YouTube. I did watch some of the speakers, and speaker after speaker from the black community talked about various issues affecting the black community. It was a group of mostly white activists from Occupy Boston that had marched to Dudley Square in solidarity. So my question to you is, do you have thoughts about this as an opportunity for breaking down some of the persistent barriers amongst African Americans and whites and other ethnic groups
Oh, I think
interracial cooperation and working together to break through? Because we're all working people. We all are the 99%, and we can work together on these issues. Do you have thoughts about this?
I do, surprisingly enough. Yeah, of course, I think this is an opportunity, but I think an even better opportunity was missed because the person who had that opportunity was Barack Obama. When he was elected president, he had he had the tremendous support of black Americans from all over the country turning out in record numbers to vote for him. But he also had a tremendous number of first-time voters, especially young voters who were not African American, who rallied to his cause. I was covering that campaign, and I'd be up in New Hampshire, out in the Midwest or on the West Coast somewhere, and I'd go into a Barack Obama headquarters, and I'd see somebody who looked like they were 11 years old, and I'd tell them, I want to speak, I'm from the New York Times, I want to speak to somebody who's running this particular Obama operation, and they would, oh, that would be me. It's like, okay, I'd take out my notebook. So he had all these young people who went to the mat and delivered for him. And he could have used that energy and that support to help him bring the kind of change that a lot of us are talking about now. But he didn't do that. He sort of moved on and left those voters behind. Now it's going to be very difficult for him to rally those voters, but what's more important is we don't have the energy of those young people working in a more organized, coherent way, which could have happened if Obama had set up some system to use their efforts. Maybe they'll be coming around now as a result of the Occupy protests and other things that are going on. I hope so. But one other thing about leadership, because you were talking about blacks and Occupy the Hood and that sort of thing, and whether this could be an opportunity to bring people together. One of the things that I think has been such a tremendous problem in this country has been the lack of leadership on so many fronts. So just like I think that we have had terrible leadership at the national level for a long time, I think that there's been a real dearth of black leadership in this country. There has not been effective black leadership for the longest time, and people are suffering as a result of that leadership. I think that there has not been a great deal of leadership, effective leadership, on women's issues, whether you talk about the feminists or whatever the particular groups or individuals might be. I don't think the kind of leadership on behalf of people who need help, assistance, guidance, whatever, I think that's been missing on a broad front. So I would like to see that leadership generated now, but I would like to see them working cooperatively. That's what happened during the Civil Rights Movement. You had that March on Washington in '63, but labor played such a big role. Jewish organizations played a tremendous role. You had all kinds of groups that participated in that, and the movers and shakers in Washington were scared to death. How are you going to bring all these folks to Washington? It's going to be riots. It's going to burn down the town. Well, that didn't happen. Yes, sir.
I'm very much concerned by what seems to be a large segment of people in this country that are middle income or less, that seem to want to embrace these wild ideas such as flat taxes, 20% flat tax, 999 flat taxes.
999.
Don't take any tax. Don't increase any taxes on the wealthiest people. I just cannot understand why. Admittedly, like someone like Herman Cain, the polls show him in the front, but that's admittedly it's only Republican voters that are being polled. Why are so many people who should know better endorsing policies that would only make things worse for them?
They don't know better. Maybe they should. But, a lot of people are very busy leading their lives, raising their families, trying to pay the mortgage, looking for a job, whatever. The right has been organized for so long. They've had talk radio putting out their propaganda day after day, month after month, year after year. You start getting these things in your head. Everything liberal is bad, so you can't even use the word liberal anymore. You don't want to punish the job creators. That's why I think we need to do a better job, those of us who care about these issues, getting our message out, explaining to people how this is in fact harmful to you and your family. This is not a neutral issue. This will actually hurt you and your family. This will foreclose opportunities for your children and your grandchildren. And we have to explain that. We have to do that in a way that's effective, not in a way that's angry or hostile or anything like that. We've just got to get our message out. It's very difficult. The right wing has a lot of simplistic slogans that sound good. They get pounded into your head year after year and that sort of thing, and then you just buy into it. And if you also have a Democratic Party at the same time that seems like it's ineffective, whose policies are in fact not helping these folks that we're talking about, have not really improved their standards of living or whatever, those folks start to think, you know what? Why should we be sending any more jobs to Washington? It's not helping me. It's all going to go to, Citibank or Chase or Goldman Sachs or whatever. So we have to do a better job of explaining what's going on in this country.
One other quick thing.
And it's going to take a long time, by the way. This is not going to change in 4 years or 8 years. If people are really want to do something about changing the direction of the country, they have to be in it for the long haul.
One other quick thing. Thank you, by the way, for that answer. But despite Kane's current surge in popularity, would you agree that the race for the Republican nomination is still Romney's to lose?
Yeah, I think Romney's going to be the nominee, and I think Romney has a very good chance of beating Barack Obama.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. I'm not predicting that. I'm just saying that I think that there's a good chance. Romney is the Republican that would have the best chance of beating Obama. Yes, sir.
I'm pleased to have been to each one of these since their inception.
Can't quite hear you.
I've been to each one of these since their inception, and I just wanted to thank you for keeping a
Thanks
tradition.
very much.
I haven't come away from one of these without being fired up in the way you said, asking for people to do something tonight, and I wanted to give people an opportunity. A group of students here are putting together a fundraiser tonight. It's in Alston, 20 Highgate. If you have your smartphone, you may want to take a note. We're collecting blankets and camping gear for the people who are taking part in Occupy Boston. It seems like just a symbol if you haven't been down there, but it's a symbol that's gotten a hold of the conscience of the nation, and I'm proud Boston's a part of it, and this lecture makes me proud to be part of this university, so I want to thank you again.
Thanks very much. You guys have surprised an awful lot of people in this country. Well, how about,
I cheated and came over here, so it should be.
there's only 4 people here. If you're real fast, we could get all 4 in. You have to be real quick.
You had written a column less than a year ago about rewriting of history about Ronald Reagan, and I wanted to thank you for that. And I just wanted to ask you, there must be something more behind it than just sentiment, because nobody's dying for Edwin Meese to be back Attorney General or Jeane Kirkpatrick back at the United Nations. I just wanted to ask you, do you think there's something more behind it? The rewrite,
More behind what?
the rewriting of history about the presidency of Ronald Reagan.
I think that that's sort of standard procedure, and I think it's part of the right-wing propaganda effort. They have a massive machine, and they do a heck of a job. They're very good at it, and I think that that's the sort of thing that needs to be countered. Very quickly.
I listened to your talk about bringing leaders together, and I can't help but think about what our fellow people in the Middle East did. And we should learn from a lesson over there, that the young people were the people that inspired. They were angry at the economic circumstances they were living under. They came together. We need to do the same thing here, to inspire and enable our young people. I know most of the people that you've talked about, to bring them to Boris Arjan, Ehrenreich, and so forth. You may know I sit on the executive committee of Demos, which is something you're I will talk later.
Yeah, by the way, I'm would like to put in a plug for Demos. I'm a distinguished senior fellow at Demos, which is a think tank in New York that does
That's why I got up to speak,
wonderful work, so I'm really glad
But
that
my point
you
is that
mentioned
we have to take a lesson from what's going on in the Middle East and identify and inspire the next generation. You said it yourself. This is going to take a long time. We need the next generation of leaders, the young people, to make the case, because, in fact, they are the ones getting hurt and getting screwed.
I absolutely agree with that, and I think that if we could pull leadership together, and I don't think it has to be all the old guard, but if we can pull some leaders together,
we've been at it
that
too
should
long.
be one of the major topics on the agenda. Yeah. Thank you. Very quickly.
Well, thank you. My question is, I heard recently that 48% of the people in Congress are millionaires, exclusive of their primary homes. And it seems to me that they are so out of touch with the rest of the country that even though before I never really believed in term limits, I'm beginning to think that we have to get rid of these people. As you said, they're really not doing anything. I was wondering what you feel.
Well, I'm surprised it's only 48% in the Senate. It's some incredible figure. Senate's known as the Millionaires Club. But you know, if you start throwing them out with term limits, what's to make you think you're not going to get more rich people following behind them? We had term limits in New York, and we elected Michael Bloomberg. I don't know how much money Michael has, man. I get scared every time I try and think of it. I tried to figure it out on my calculator, how much money our mayor has. It broke my calculator, all those numbers. So, and we had term limits for Michael Bloomberg. You're only supposed to serve 2 terms in New York City. Bloomberg got the law changed. So,
Well, how do you get rid of these bums?
we have to do. We have to get the people to rise up to get the politicians, whoever they might be, to respond to those issues that the people want and in the way that the people want. In fact, that would work. Politicians are frightened of the voters when the voters come en masse. But if they know that they're just going to get reelected and reelected and reelected, they just spend their time serving their corporate masters. The important thing is for the people themselves to rise up, to protest, to raise heck, and to vote. Yes.
Hi. Having had the privilege of Howard Zinn as a professor twice, he would have been very, very proud of you and this speech. I'm a high school teacher, and one of the most difficult things that I face is what are my students going to do when they get out of high school? Do you have any ideas for, where should education be going? I mean, someone had just spoken about the young people. I was here in the 80s when we were trying to get BU to divest out of here, and there was like a solid thing we could do, but sometimes I find students are somewhat apathetic, and do you have any ideas that we could
education is, I'm not an expert on education. I'm going to be actually writing somewhat about education in my book. My wife is the founder and president of the Posse Foundation, which is a great education organization, sends big city kids off to elite colleges, including Boston University. But a couple of the quickest thoughts that come off the top of my head is that the first thing we need to do is stop this idea of bad-mouthing teachers and being on the tack
Thank you.
against teachers all over the place, because that just seems crazy to me. What we need to do is give teachers as much support, and nobody, you know, the other side tries to make it sound like you're in favor of having horrible teachers in the classroom, which is an absurdity. What we need to be doing is giving teachers as much support as possible so that they can do the best job on behalf of our youngsters. We need more teachers in the classroom, but instead we're getting rid of teachers, which is just craziness. So we need to do that. We need to focus on teachers, but also we have to figure out ways to make education affordable. Kids, if we work on teachers on the one hand and get kids really enthusiastic about schoolwork and that sort of thing, and then moving on to the next level, we then have to make the next level possible, which means it has to be affordable. And we haven't figured out how to do that yet. We've priced out the poor long ago. I know I hear all this stuff about Pell Grants and all kinds of other aid to the poor, but I go around the country and I see all these poor kids who can't afford to go to college. But we've gone beyond that. We're now pricing out the middle class, as you know, and that's just crazy given the world that we're in. I wish I had a better answer for you, but I am in the process of trying to get myself up to speed on education issues, since I'm going to be writing about it like I know something about it. So thank you for your question.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for coming tonight.